In the last video, we had set up our contour 2D toolpath. And so now what I want to do is go over how to do the simulation and also change the cutter compensation, or at least um, adjust the cutter compensation to kind of show you what happens with that. So you begin to understand what the cutter compensation left or right does for you. So one of the things that I want to do here is just go right into doing the actual simulation. Over here on the left-hand side, where the toolpath manager is, there is this small, it's a small part, and right beside it, there's an actual green check mark, and it's verify selected operations. And you can see what happens when I click that is we end up in this other window here that opens up, and that's actually where the simulator runs through the simulation of the part being cut. So there's different ways that we can do this. We can actually step through the entire thing or play the entire thing from beginning to end, or we can step through and step forward into the part so that you can actually see the tool moving down in increments and then cutting through the part in increments. What I'm going to do right now, though, is I'm actually just going to close this again so we can go back to this screen so that you guys can first see the depth that we're going here. So we're going to a final milling depth of a negative 0.75 off of the top of the stock. And by the way, in the previous video, I had made the mistake of mentioning that these blocks were actually only a half an inch in thickness, and in reality they're an inch in thickness. So I did try to put in some text across the screen to call your attention to that mistake in the previous video so that I didn't have to re-record the entire thing. But I also want to go back in here and show you in the parameters, just remind you why it is that we have this cut divided up into 3 equal sections. So if you want to change anything that's in that dialog box, simply come over here to the toolpath manager, left click on the parameters, and it opens them up again. Our final milling depth of negative 0.75 is actually set down here in the linking parameters. So you can see this is where that final milling depth is. The other thing that we did, though, is we set depth cuts so that as the milling cutter comes down, we can make it just go down to a certain depth and then retract and then come back down a little bit deeper and then finally do that a third time. We set those max rough steps to 0.25. And so that's why this is divided into 3 equal steps. So the milling cutter is going to come down, go through and cut at negative 0.25. Then it's going to come down and cut at negative 0.50. Then it's going to come down and cut at negative 0.75, which is our final milling depth. So I'm going to select OK to get out of this and then go into our simulation and show you that step by step. So if I just step this down, you can see, so now the cutter is actually into the material, it steps across, it retracts, goes back over, and then goes down to the next milling depth, and then just keeps doing that. So as I keep selecting that until I get all the way through. So I can keep doing this, and because we started our chain over here, that's why the tool started over here, made the cut, came up, and then came all the way back through and made the additional cuts all the way down to the final milling depth. It's now going to enter the material over here and make the cuts in this direction instead, and that's because we chained the other side here. So that's kind of an unnecessary step, but I wanted to do that just to show you a couple different things about chaining and also cutter compensation direction. So there's better ways of doing this, and in the next video that I do related to this part, I'll show you a more efficient way to do this, a simpler way to do this. But again, realize that the reason that I did this here was to kind of show an exaggerated version of this so that I can demonstrate some other things to you with regards to cutter compensation direction. So if I want to reset this simulation, I can use this double arrow back. And what I'll do is I'll just show you how this runs all the way through as well. We'll talk more about some of the things that are shown here in the simulation later, But for right now, what I want to do is go back and talk a little bit about cutter compensation and what we've done here. So in this initial take at this, we set our in our cut parameters, we set our compensation type to be computer, and we set our compensation direction to be to the right. So what that did for us then, and I'm just going to go ahead and okay this out and go to our top view here. What that did for us by setting the cutter compensation to the right is we moved the tool path that we chained was along here and moving from left to right. So what we did though is by setting the cutter compensation to the right, we actually shifted the radius of that tool over to the right of its tool path. And so now it's cutting in here at the center. If I go back in and adjust this so that now the cutter compensation would be to the left, we're going to see what happens here. And by the way, anytime you make changes to these parameters, you're going to have to either regenerate by verifying or running the post processing, or you can just come in here and regenerate all of the selected operations, which is what I'll do here. So whenever I go to do this now my yellow lines are actually on the outside. That's because my tool direction hasn't changed. It still moves from left to right and then down here from right to left on the screen, but my cutter compensation direction did change. And so now I've changed it to the left, which means it shifts this cutter radius out here to the left in this direction, but also out to the left in this direction. So now when I run my simulation, my part is going to look dramatically different simply because of the way that I've changed the cutter compensation to be. So I'll go ahead and just run this through, and you can see now, instead of having a cut through the center of the part, now I've actually got a cut that's on the outside of these chained lines. Again, because the tool direction is from left to right, but my cutter compensation direction was shifted to the left. And so that's why the cutter's out here. So if I go back in and change that parameter to the way that I originally had it, which would be the cutter compensation direction to the right, now you're going to see, as I go ahead and do the verification, and it prompts me to regenerate, by the way. So I'll go ahead and do that. Now it shifts back to the way it had been. So that's a brief introduction to the simulation, a brief introduction to cutter compensation, and we'll talk more about those things in the next